China's $12 electric motor doesn't just lower the price of a motor, it can reset the price everyone else expects to pay. And that's where this story gets uncomfortable. Because when one company sells a component for less, competitors can usually respond. They cut costs, negotiate with suppliers, improve efficiency, maybe sacrifice a little margin. But what happens when the lower price isn't coming from one clever factory? What if it's coming from an entire manufacturing system built around producing components at enormous scale? That's a very different kind of competition. And it creates a question that goes far beyond electric motors. How can a component that costs around $12 put pressure on an industrial market worth tens of billions of dollars? At first, the answer seems obvious. It's cheaper, but that answer is almost too simple. Because the real power of a cheap motor isn't the money saved on the motor itself. It's what happens after that saving moves through the rest of the machine. Imagine a manufacturer building a piece of equipment. The machine needs a motor. The motor needs copper, steel, bearings, insulation, electronics, precision parts, and assembly. For years, the manufacturer may have accepted those costs as simply part of doing business. Then a supplier offers something dramatically cheaper. The first reaction isn't necessarily excitement. It might be suspicion. Is the quality good enough? Will it last? Can it handle the workload? What happens if something fails? And perhaps most importantly, how can anyone sell it for that price? That last question is where the real story begins. Because China didn't suddenly wake up one morning and decide to make electric motors cheap. The lower price is connected to something much larger: scale. When thousands or millions of similar components are being produced, factories can spread equipment costs across huge volumes. Suppliers can specialize, parts can move shorter distances, manufacturers can negotiate with competing suppliers, engineers can improve designs through repeated production. And factories don't have to build every part of the supply chain from scratch. That matters more than it sounds. A motor factory surrounded by suppliers is operating under completely different conditions from a factory that has to source every component from hundreds of miles away. If a bearing supplier is nearby, that's useful. If a steel supplier is nearby, that's useful. If precision machining, winding, casting, electronics, packaging, and logistics are all part of the same industrial ecosystem, the advantage starts multiplying. One small saving becomes another, then another, and another. Eventually, the product at the end of the chain can look almost impossible from the outside, but here's where the price war begins. Because the $12 motor doesn't stay inside the motor industry, it enters another company's cost structure. A machine builder buys the motor. The machine builder sells equipment. Another company buys that equipment. That company uses it to manufacture something else. And suddenly, the original $12 price is no longer just a component price. It's part of a much larger economic chain. This is the part many people miss. Businesses don't compete only on the price of their final products. They compete on the cost of everything underneath those products, and motors are everywhere: pumps, fans, conveyors, compressors, machine tools, industrial automation, HVAC equipment, appliances, material handling systems. Countless machines depend on the simple idea of turning electrical energy into movement. So when the cost of that movement changes, even slightly, the economics of the machines around it can change too. And this creates a strange situation for established manufacturers. Suppose your company has spent decades building a reputation around reliability. You have engineers, factories, distributors, service teams, inventory, certifications, long-term customer relationships. Your motor may cost more, but customers know your brand. Then a lower-cost competitor arrives. At first, you may not worry. After all, industrial buyers aren't always looking for the cheapest possible part. They care about reliability. Downtime can cost more than the motor itself. A failed component can shut down an entire production line. So quality matters, but then something changes. The cheaper product gets better, the supplier becomes more reliable, customers gain experience with it, and suddenly the question isn't, why would anyone buy the cheaper motor? It's, why are we still paying more? That is a much more dangerous question, because once customers begin asking it, the pressure moves upstream. The manufacturer has three choices: cut the price, reduce costs, or explain why the premium is worth paying. None of those choices is easy. Cutting prices hurts margins. Reducing costs takes time and investment. and explaining the premium becomes harder when the cheaper product is good enough for the customer's needs. That's how a price war begins without anyone officially declaring one. Nobody has to announce it. The market does it for them, and here's the uncomfortable part. The cheapest supplier doesn't necessarily need to make the highest margin on every motor. If lower prices help generate more orders can create more production can improve efficiency. Greater efficiency can support lower prices can attract more customers. And more customers create more production again. It's a loop. Price creates volume creates efficiency supports price, and price creates more volume. This is where China's manufacturing model becomes especially important. The advantage isn't simply that one factory can produce a motor cheaply. The bigger advantage is that a huge industrial ecosystem can make producing that motor easier, faster, and more competitive. And that changes the nature of the competition. An American manufacturer isn't necessarily competing against one Chinese factory. It may be competing against a network of suppliers, manufacturers, logistics companies, specialized workers, equipment makers, and enormous domestic demand. That's a completely different opponent, and rebuilding that ecosystem is not as simple as opening a factory. You can build the building, you can buy the machines, you can hire workers, but can you recreate the supplier network around it? Can you get the same component variety? Can you match production volume? Can you negotiate the same prices? Can you respond to custom orders just as quickly? Can you make the same product and still sell it at a price customers are willing to pay? That's the real industrial challenge, and it leads to an even bigger contradiction. For years, businesses were encouraged to make supply chains more efficient, buy from the lowest cost supplier, reduce inventory, specialize. Move production where it makes economic sense. That strategy worked incredibly well when the primary goal was lower cost, but now another question has entered the conversation. What happens when the cheapest supply chain becomes strategically important? That's where the motor stops being just a business story. It becomes a supply chain story, and eventually, a geopolitical story. Because America doesn't have to lose the ability to manufacture motors for this to matter. It only needs to discover that another country can manufacture certain components at a cost it struggles to match. That difference can influence which machines are cheaper, which factories are competitive, which products reach consumers at lower prices, and over time where companies choose to build. This is why a tiny component can matter to a massive industry. The component itself might represent only a small fraction of the final machine, but costs don't exist in isolation. They accumulate. A $5 saving here, $10 there, a cheaper motor, a cheaper controller, a cheaper housing, a faster supplier, lower shipping costs, higher production volume. Each individual advantage can look insignificant. Together, they can completely change the economics. And that's the point where the original $12 number starts to look different. It isn't really about $12, it's about the gap between two manufacturing systems. One system may be optimized around established brands, higher service expectations, local production, and long-standing industrial relationships. Another may be optimized around enormous production volumes, dense supplier networks, aggressive competition, and constant cost reduction. Neither system is perfect. The low-cost system can face problems too. Quality varies, trade barriers can change, shipping costs move, tariffs can reshape pricing. Customers may demand local production. Governments may decide that strategic industries cannot depend entirely on overseas suppliers, and industrial buyers still care about reliability, safety, and technical support. So this isn't a simple story where one side wins and the other disappears. That's not how markets usually work. The real story is more complicated. Some manufacturers will move production closer to customers. Some will keep importing, some will build partnerships, some will specialize in high-performance motors where price isn't the only consideration, others will focus on the low-cost end of the market. And some companies may discover that their greatest advantage isn't manufacturing the motor at all. It's designing better machines around cheaper motors. That's an important distinction. Because disruption doesn't always destroy the old business. Sometimes it changes where the value is created. If motors become cheaper, the winners may not simply be motor manufacturers. The winners could be companies that use those cheaper motors to build better robots, cheaper automation equipment, more affordable pumps, more efficient HVAC systems, lower-cost factory machinery. New products that were previously too expensive to manufacture, and this creates the most interesting possibility of all. A cheaper motor could actually expand the market. When a component becomes affordable enough, customers who couldn't justify buying it before may suddenly enter the market. Small factories can automate, smaller manufacturers can upgrade equipment, new businesses can experiment. Products that once required expensive machinery can become economically viable. So the same force that threatens one company's margins can create an entirely new market somewhere else. That's the paradox of industrial disruption. Someone loses the old economics, while someone else discovers new economics. And that brings us back to the $12 motor. The biggest mistake would be to look at it and ask only, is this motor cheaper? The better question is, what does this price make possible? Because if a motor becomes dramatically cheaper, the machine around it can become cheaper. If the machine becomes cheaper, more businesses can afford it. If more businesses buy it, production increases. If production increases, suppliers become more specialized. If suppliers become more specialized, costs can fall again. And suddenly, a tiny component has become part of a much larger feedback loop. That's when a price becomes a strategy. And that's when an industrial market can begin changing without one giant company announcing that the old model is dead. The change happens quietly. A purchasing manager switches suppliers. A manufacturer redesigns a machine. A distributor changes what it stocks. A customer chooses the cheaper option. Another competitor responds, then another. Nobody sees the entire transformation in one moment. They only see individual decisions, until one day the old price no longer feels normal. And that may be the most important part of China's $12 motor story. The real threat isn't that every traditional motor company suddenly disappears. The real threat is that the market itself begins to redefine what a motor should cost. Once that happens, companies aren't competing against yesterday's price anymore. They're competing against a new expectation, and expectations are incredibly difficult to reverse because customers remember lower prices. They build them into their calculations. They redesign products around them. They create businesses around them. And once an entire industry adapts to a cheaper component, going back can become almost impossible. So maybe the $12 motor isn't really the story, maybe it's the warning. A warning that the next phase of global manufacturing may not be about who can build the biggest factory, but who can make every layer underneath that factory cheaper, faster, and more connected. And if that continues, the biggest disruption may not come from the products China exports today. It could come from the components that make tomorrow's products cheaper to build in the first place. That's why a $12 motor can matter far more than $12, because in industrial economics, the smallest price difference can sometimes create the biggest competitive advantage. And once that advantage starts moving through the supply chain, the price war is no longer happening between two motors. It's happening between two ways of building the future.